Hi, so first off, thanks very much for coming here to hear a little about what we do. Just by way of introduction, I come to you by way of South Africa initially, where I trained as a physician, and after that I proceeded to study biomedical informatics, actually at the same program that what trained at in New York. I would say I'm almost completely recovered from being a physician in South Africa. And I'd like to tell you a little bit more about what I'm doing these days. So the premise that underlies a lot of the work that I'm doing, or at least what I think would be of greatest interest to you as a group, is that if we move from viewing the literature as a collection of documents and view it instead as a collection of concepts that are related to one another, we can do some interesting things. So humans can do interesting things and machines can do interesting things with this also. And one of these interesting things is something called literature-based discovery, which is an approach to discovering new relationships in the literature developed by Don Swanson, who was an information scientist. And what he discovered was that by pulling concepts out of the literature, it was possible to find connections between concepts that hadn't previously been discovered by building bridges from one concept to another. And he was able to identify famously a new therapeutic alternative for Raynaud's syndrome this way, which turned out to be effective in a clinical trial, although it's by no means the mainstay of treatment for Raynaud's currently. Where I became interested in this problem is at the point where there's a fair amount of evidence by now in the literature that this approach can work, so you can find meaningful associations between things that aren't yet stated explicitly. But to do this requires a fair amount of computational work. So I've been working on trying to develop ways to do this more efficiently, using models that are known as models of distributional semantics, which is what Susan was forced to say when she introduced me. And the idea behind these models is to learn representations of terms or concepts in the literature from the way in which they're distributed across this literature. So things that occur together are associated with one another. They're guilty of being related by association, you could say. What we've discovered with these methods is it's possible to identify a large number of implicit relationships between things. Only a small fraction of those are of any interest for the development of potential therapies or for other reasons. So there's been an interest in the literature-based discovery community in trying to refine these searches by taking into account not only that things are vaguely related to one another, but looking at the ways in which they're related to one another. And these sorts of relationships can be extracted from the literature using technology along the lines of what Juani's group developed. So what I'm going to show you now, I thought because I'm the last talk, maybe I have some license to put a video clip in, just to. And I'm going to show you a clip of a user interacting with a system that we developed that allows him to explore the literature at this conceptual level. So the user concerned is a domain expert in the biology of the vitamin D receptor.
There's some gamma bonding sites in some of the proteins, some of the vitamin D.
Right, so I think I don't have time to go through all of this, but what you're hearing is this biologist thinking aloud as they navigate through the system. So we studied their interaction with the system this way. And what we found was that frequently he would encounter relationships that he didn't know existed, even though he's written the review paper on the subject he was exploring. And the reason we found that this happened was that the relationships concerned didn't come from the core literature that he reads. So there may have been relationships out of the dental literature, for example, but they were nonetheless relevant to some of the problems that he was tackling with his group. So that's the sort of thing a human can do with the ability to navigate through concepts and relations that have been extracted from the literature. We've also become interested in what machines can do, because machines can process many more of these relationships simultaneously than a single human can do. And so we've been looking into the use of these relationships to try to discover new therapeutic uses for existing pharmaceutical agents. And we've shown that we haven't got to the point where anything that we've uncovered has been tested on humans. We have shown we can predict to some degree which agents will be effective against cancer cells in preclinical experiments. And then we're applying a similar approach to try to determine which relationships between drugs and potential side effects are plausible based on knowledge that's extracted from the literature. So this is the work largely of Ning Shang or Sunny, who I've put a picture up of her here. And she's focusing on this for her doctoral work. And the idea with this work ultimately is to combine it with some of the things that Hua and his group are doing, such that we have from the data warehouse that's derived from the patient records strongly associated drugs and side effects that were not previously known. And then we want to feed those through the models extracted from the literature to try to determine if they're plausible, at least according to the best knowledge we're able to extract. If this works, I see my animation is not going to show here, but if this works, we're presented with something of an information retrieval problem, because if this works, then the next step would be for someone to say, okay, well, why does your system think that this drug and this side effect, or this drug and this potential, this disease it might potentially treat are related? And then we have out of these models sets of reasoning pathways, and we're able to retrieve all of the literature from which the assertions that make up the reasoning pathways have been derived. And unfortunately, this often leaves us with tens of thousands of assertions and articles, and we're not quite sure at this point how we would show this to a human or let them explore it in a way that would be efficient, which is something we're looking into currently. So, in conclusion, what I've been talking about today are models that are derived from this idea of literature-based discovery, but they're developed to be scalable to large amounts of biomedical literature, and they allow for search at the conceptual level, at the level of concepts and relations, which allows people, even within their domain of expertise, to find things that surprise them. And it allows machines to draw inferences that seem to be accurate to some degree at identifying therapeutic relationships and relationships between drugs and side effects. So with that, I'd just like to acknowledge my funding sources. So the funding for this work largely comes from the National Library of Medicine, and then also the many fine collaborators that I've had on this work as it's developed. And so that's my 10-minute talk. I'd be happy to take questions if anyone.